weiter.
I have the privilege of being the founding co-director for the Inspired Leadership Initiative here at Notre Dame. It is a program that allows people to either come to or come back to Notre Dame for an entire academic year to discover, to discern, and to really decide what their next act is going to be in life. I want to thank all who are coming online and streaming this thing. We're really pleased to have you here. And I also want to thank our audience of ILI fellows who are here tonight. We are excited and humble about the turnout for the Inspired Leadership Initiative and the inspiring conversations that we're having. Today's theme is basically Journey Towards Purpose. And we have more than 1,300 people that have beamed in prior inspiring conversations from 34 different countries. So I really want to thank those who've helped put this together to help us bring this to a reality, particularly the people that think ND and the Alumni Association. We've designed today's session to be as interactive as possible, and you'll have the opportunity both online and here in the audience to be able to ask questions if you want to of our guests. So there is a Google form in the description of the live stream that you can write your questions, and then we will filter the questions here so we can get them to our guests. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce George Lopez. George Lopez, Professor Lopez, is a Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies at the Keough School of the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies. He's a pretty amazing guy. He helped co-found that 36 years ago. A long time ago, George. He's also a leading expert on sanctions and economy and the impact of peace building, various peace-related issues. During his 36 years of affiliating with the Kroc Institute, he's also had the chance to be able to work with the United Nations and many other international organizations. He also has just recently written 3 articles in January, in February, and in March about the Ukraine situation, and you'll probably have a chance to be able to hear about those. So he was anticipating this in January and wrote about it right after it started, and then again in March. Tom Schreier is the founding director of the Inspired Leadership Initiative, and after a very successful career in transportation and financial services, Father John tapped him on his shoulder, and Tom accepted the opportunity to start up this program, and we're now in our 3rd cohort with 22 amazing people and their spouses and their partners. We think that you're really going to enjoy this very inspiring conversation. Let me turn it over to Tom. Tom, take it away.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thank you very much. And I also want to welcome everybody, both our live guests here from the ILI and those of you that are streaming and joining us virtually, and those who will watch us as we're recorded. In addition to all of the wonderful things that Chris mentioned about George, George has been a friend of the ILI literally from the very, very beginning. And he's worked with us in an incredible number of really generous and generative ways. So we're truly grateful for everything that George has done with us, because he's not only brought the knowledge of his experience and his scholarship, but also his process of discerning his path in life. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that in addition to his expertise this evening. So let's get this started. George, the title of our series is A Journey Towards Purpose. Talk a little bit about how somebody at a young age decides to take a journey towards being an expert in the fields that you're an expert in sanctions and peace building and other such topics, because that truly has purpose.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I want to thank ND and certainly ILI, which I feel so much a part of, despite the fact that these are people who have decided to actually retire, and I'm someone who the program carries along for being failed in retirement. So to begin with the question of why and how I started in this, I'm not being comical when I say, if you grew up where I grew up in peace building, where I grew up in Brooklyn, either you knew how to be a peace builder or you were a member of the gang. And so I chose that partly because my mother led me in that direction. And I was able to have mentors along the way that continued to say, especially for my generation, a generation that was growing up in the Vietnam War, where do we want the planet to go? Some of us were talking before cameras went on about what a interesting, terrible, and convoluting time we're in for those of us who are a generation who came through the nuclear era when we hid under desks, worried about what might happen after the Cuban Missile Crisis and various other things we've seen. The notion that this is happening in 2022 is really something as to why I feel like that journey that began long ago seemed to have good periods of interruption, but never a full hiatus. because violent conflict, unfortunately, has always been with us. And the blessing to come to the Kroc Institute to help co-create it in 1986 was just something where, as some of you may have had in your life, where there's a strange meeting of what, in the language of the ILI program, is your heart's desire to make peace, and a program that will actually pay you to train people to do that, some of which I know are on our streaming, so hi out there. So I've been very, very fortunate, but when you're given much, much should be expected of you, and that's what we've been trying to do, and that's the blessing of the Kroc Institute and the Keough School, even as we struggle uphill at this moment to try to affect peace building through whatever tools, including a set of harsh tools that we're going to talk about, which are economic sanctions.
So was there something particular about this situation, even before it actually emerged in the Ukraine, that caused you to think, boy, I think it's maybe time to fail at retirement again and to re-engage?
A couple of things. One is while a number of the things that did occupy me in full-time work at the policy and other level weren't operative, I was involved with some colleagues from many other countries in a major thinking, research, and writing project on how we were able to possibly stifle the worst humanitarian impact of sanctions that didn't really achieve their goals. They were aimed at leaders, but people in the society generally were paying a price for these. Is there ways we can mitigate this? Are there ways in which we can find a set of tools that's more appropriate for the offense committed that we want to punish or we want to stifle, and make this system more kind of lubricated in a way that affirms its best values of peace building? And in the midst of that, I had some good dialogues with people in Washington and elsewhere about, is there a way in which sanctions can actually be a deterrent? As Mr. Putin began to assemble what looked like the tools of imminent war in November, December, is there a way in which we can send a message? And I thought more deeply about this, as were lots of other folks. And it was clear to many of us that this might be the case that actually proves the rule. If you're fully transparent about everything terrible you're going to do to a leader in the economy, you will focus the mind on the costs versus benefits, the costs of incurring sanctions versus the benefits of the unrestrained policy you're about to pursue. And there were a great number of beliefs that this would give pause to what might happen, allow the Ukrainians to be more ready, or certainly change the character of the invasion to be limited and to be a spanking rather than a devastation. And we thought that let's folks in government said, let's give that a try. And one of the first essays I wrote was, here's the conditions that'll help make this a deterrent. And one of them was beginning to realize this is a case that could prove the rule of, if you have united front of imposers, the Western Alliance, if the imposers recognize they themselves will incur costs, so it's not just hurting the opponent or the target, it's hurting yourself. And if there's a large, dramatic, immediate imposition, but still arrows left in the quiver, then it's an interesting dynamic that usually puts a tougher squeeze on a target. So watching that unfold, seeing its immediate impact, and the global financial system crossing some thresholds it hadn't done before about going after central banks, going after oligarchs, using the imposition on the SWIFT system. This array of tools was the harshest and the most immediate, and I think what's going to be the most devastating, for better or worse, set of sanctions that we've ever imposed.
So it would seem to me anyway, and maybe you can offer your thoughts on this, that rational actions require rational actors, right? So maybe just contextualize that a little bit in the context of a leader like Vladimir Putin and how that affects the kind of sanctions strategy you might put into place.
Yeah, that's a good question, especially since it came up so frequently on the news and occasionally still does. Is he functioning on all cylinders? Is he lost it a bit? Is this an irrational actor, etc.? One of the useful dimensions of sanctions is the other side doesn't have to be rational if it's very clear that compared to your guesses about them, they're calculating costs and benefits differently. It doesn't matter whether it's a fully calculated view on their part, it's how we can then measure their calculus and then judge some levels of irrationality. Will people make decisions that we call irrational because, as we've been learning, they've been in an environment where no one ever actually assessed the full costs to them? There were a number of calculations Mr. Putin made, particularly you saw in the news in January and in February as this began, the naysayers about sanctions, and I mean that affectionately, not in a bad or critical way, said, hey, you don't understand, this guy's brought $630 billion worth of assets back into the country. He knew how bad sanctions would be. He'd certainly withstand them. He's a smart guy. He may have outsmarted us. What people didn't understand is he had also been told or calculated on his own in the calling back of those assets, about a third of those remained in Western banks that were ready to be jettisoned when Putin called them back after he started the war. By the time he started the war, we had already locked down these things in the first 16 hours. About a third of it he couldn't bring back. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was that he never thought we would go to the SWIFT system, to a number of other kinds of lockdowns. He thought the Germans wouldn't agree. He thought there were a number of loopholes to get away with right away, and he wouldn't have to use the remaining 2/3 of the so-called stash that was going to protect him from actually withstanding this for a while. Most analysts right now, and here we are, 2.5 months into this, say that maybe as much as a half of the other 2/3 will be needed by Russia this year alone to try to continue to prop up the ruble, to try to restore various aspects of the strength of the economy. And this was supposed to be the war chest that could sustain you through what, remember, he thought was a very quick war. All of these logics are falling apart. So he was rational, given the set of understandings, given the assumptions. And now it looks like historically terrible judgment.
So how much of that is a function of the breadth and depth of the sanction activity that's been imposed by countries that, at least I, as an uninformed listener to the news on this, it strikes me that there are countries that are actually engaging in the sanctions activity that might not have been expected, and perhaps they were expected by you and others that have been involved in this. But maybe talk a little bit about that breadth and depth and how that's kind of factored into this overall.
Yeah,
calculus.
I think it was significant. Dave Corwright and I, when we wrote an article right as these things were being imposed, said some of us didn't think we'd be able to be at this spot of not only unanimity, but diversity of sanctions also having unanimity. And it has a lot to do with the diplomatic work that was done, some of it visible, some of it clearly under the radar by the Biden administration in December and January. I mean, you may remember this, that as the war clouds were clearly formed and the new German leader came to Washington, D.C., was asked in a press conference, will you shut off the pipeline? Will you end this deal if needed, or even now? One of the debates in D.C., Senator Cruz had a piece of legislation where he wanted the Senate to call on Germany and call on President Biden before the war might begin to shut off the pipeline. And some others in the administration felt, no, that gives away too much ability for him to say they're already at war with me. So we were going to hold that. But we expected an answer from Germany at that press conference. Of course, we're in alliance with you no matter what. We will do without what. And everybody was saying, boy, Germany might go either way here. Oh my goodness, here comes the invasion. We're imposing this. The Germans were the first diplomatically out of the gate, talking about unanimity, talking we're going to shut down this pipeline. Here's what we're going to do. And we know we're incurring costs. So I think one of the things that's distinctive about this, in it working so punishingly well at the start, was the unanimity and the sense of thousands of people in the streets. See, no leader had to convince their population that this was a bad thing to try to support Ukraine. The thousands of people in the streets, what we call civil society and social science and political science, came out and saying, we're with Ukraine. Then it's pretty easy for a prime minister to say, because we're with Ukraine, we will do the following.
So is there a fatigue factor you worry about in that context of, the initial kind of enthusiasm and kind of support, breadth of support diminishing over time as those people who are in the sanctioning countries begin to feel an impact themselves, such as gas prices in the U.S. and potentially fuel shortages in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think that's always a concern. You're always concerned about someone who feels it's good for our immediate economic needs to undercut the system, et cetera. But even as we are meeting today, there was a meeting of the allies to talk about what do we do about the gasoline consumption. We know that's still a kind of lifeline for Putin. Should we continue to just gut it out? Every sanctions, even the strongest ones, have a little leakage. Is that good because it keeps gas prices at least contained? Or should we go ahead and bite the bullet further? And I think just the fact that that conversation is occurring is one good path for this. The path that most concerns me is not whether or not folks might say, I need to be the exception right here, and others grant that. What really bothers me in a scholarly way is the critics who are saying, I don't know why we continue the sanctions. They didn't deter him. They haven't had him stop the war, and it doesn't look like he's not going to attain his goals. And that's such a narrow view because maybe people like us who were writing articles should have said, yes, we expected, hoped, thought there was a chance that sanctions would deter. When they wouldn't, we knew that we were imposing a punishing strategy that would not immediately change behavior, but would make so devastating the costs apparent and unfolding that there's now going to be a new dialogue around Putin's inner circle. And we know there's ways that that's occurring. And that there's going to be clarity by analysts who say, even if it stops tomorrow, Russia's economy is functioning at a 1920s level and will take a long time to recover. So, is there a point at which you wish it changed that calculus of a decision maker? Yes. But we didn't expect in imposing the sanctions at the start of the invasion to change the calculus. We expected to increase the pain of continued pursuit of this policy. And economically, we're winning the economic war. Unfortunately, we've not been able to stop various aspects of the most brutal military war. And I think that if people say, is that worth it? Is that fair to Ukraine? Is that fair to the Russian people? It's a second best strategy because diplomacy should have worked, because further dialogue should have worked. But on a second best strategy, it's the strength of the West to be able to continue to force recalculation in many ways. And I think we have to be astute about how, if a diplomatic opening created from that exists, we jump into it immediately.
So this brings to mind, at least for me, the concept of measuring effectiveness. So maybe talk a little bit about measuring effectiveness, both kind of in the midst of a continuing situation where the sanctions are imposed, and then maybe even from a scholarly perspective, kind of ex post facto. How do you measure the effectiveness of sanctions?
It's a huge part of our research enterprise. There are a number of characteristics that I think we can apply to this case. One is everybody on board? And as I mentioned earlier, are they willing to incur their own costs? That's the most significant set of it's being effective in the sense that it's solid. It will continue not to be subject to the exploitation and incentives provided by the target to undercut the sanctions, either for political or economic reasons. It's the reason sanctions didn't work before the 1990s very well. Why? Because there were more benefits that went to the sanctions busters than went to being part of the group that held together, because you believe that you're going to hold together in times of peace. That's what makes trade work. Well, the same thing works when you're going to cut down economic exchange. We hold together, the system will continue to work for us. So that's the first issue. The second is, does the leader that's targeted have the ability to turn the sanctions, not economically, but politically inside out, and to say, I told you we were going to be singular victims of this hostile world. Therefore, everyone tighten their belt, accept the costs of sanctions. It's the patriotic duty, and let us march on. For the ability to do that, the dictator's got to jump on that soapbox and try to rally the people around the flag, but also then the people in the crowd have got to say, yes, let's go. I mean, this was Milosevic's secret in the Yugoslav situation. He was able to tell the Serbs, I told you they were always out to get you. Now they are. Let us bind together. And that's what made that sanctions set so exhaustive over time and almost dysfunctional. But here what happened is Putin tried to jump up on the soapbox, and there were demonstrations in the streets of multiple towns. There's now somewhat in the order of 17,000 to 21,000 people in jail. And the most significant thing, which actually I think speaks to effect, but was unanticipated by any of us, was within the first 10 days, the number of entrepreneurial, upper middle class, highly skilled, intellectual, and creative class picked up the money and they left. I'm on vacation for 3 weeks in Turkey. I'm visiting my sister in Algeria. I'm out, whatever. The brain drain, the deterioration of a middle sector is something we didn't anticipate. But if you're taking harsh economic indicators, that's a hit. That's a significant hit. And the last one, I think, is governments impose sanctions. Governments set the rules. But of course, as we know, it's the private sector. It's the banking sector, manufacturing, tourist industries, schools. They implement. The notion that the private sectors of the Western world came together so quickly to reinforce, yes, we will do this, pull out from, there's 3,000 American companies in Russia in 2021. The notion that so many of them closed their doors for now and decided to pull out some assets. Others are having assets seized by the government of Russia like crazy, but they're willing to incur the cost. And that unity pounds and pounds away. Key economic indicators, if an economy experiences a contraction somewhere between 3 and 5%, the sanctions are seen as devastating. The estimates right now by the World Bank and independent organizations is 11 to 16% of a contraction in the Russian economy. So yeah, these are hurting, they're big time, their cost is going to be terrible to this economy. When it's all over, the multiple tragedies of this experience is what? We will have a devastated society, culture in Ukraine, and we'll have an economy pushed back to the 19th century in Russia.
So you talked a little bit about the word leakage. Just some perspective on the enforcement and kind of monitoring of sanctions and kind of when it's most important in the cycle and how that's actually accomplished.
Yeah, and this too makes it a sort of unique case. When we've imposed sanctions before on countries and militias in civil war in Africa, which is the dominant set of about 30 cases of sanctions over the 3 decades, or on an Iran or Venezuela with a single product that brings them income, there's always a set of international illicit networks, sanctions busters, that are quickly going to jump into the fray and say, if we relabel tankers, if we repaint the boats, if we do these things, we can smuggle stuff out of your country and we can get currency to you. You can undercut the system. We do this all the time in oil transfers. Or we find ways to get illicit arms to market and do this and this and this. In this case, Russia is the highest performing multifaceted economy that's ever been sanctioned. While oil is an important generator of revenue, it's not the only one. They relied a lot on tourist dollars, on multiple bank transfers, on investments, etc. Why did they default on debt? Because they were heavily invested in various bonds and bought, and they had a payment due, and now they can't pay. That kind of dynamic interdependence that is based on what? A transparent and usually legal system of exchange doesn't transfer well to sanctions evasion, illicit pirating of material, and the like. So the leakage that is there is what we're seeing, the oil and the gas. And it's what keeps him a little bit maybe optimistic. We'll see what the next couple of days produce. But there's not a lot of gun running and other things here that are producing revenue for the economy.
So are there other tools that you would advocate using in this context, either sanction tools or just other tools in this situation?
Well, I think it's very clear to the West that the most significant tool that can reinforce the impact of the sanctions is stifling the military advance. And that's been taken up, and all the space has been taken up by the supplying of weapons, logistics, intelligence, and the like. We're hearing a lot right now as we're engaged in this conversation of the refocusing of Russian strategy in trying to come and take Donbass, trying to encircle Ukrainian troops that are deeply embedded in the section of Donbass where they can fight on both sides, and any number of things. It'll be interesting to see whether the West can both help militarily stifle that advance and then creatively advance a ceasefire. Because what we need more than anything else is a ceasefire. What we need more than anything else is, if we can't get a total ceasefire, an outlawing of the missiles. We'll see. I don't know. Some people have said we should act with clarity and speed and indict Putin before the World Court. I don't think Putin, under any conditions, worries about, oh my goodness, I can't do the World Court on Tuesday. Yeah. What am I supposed to do? So we'll see what happens.
So talk about the interplay between the role of individual governments and also the role of the United Nations in the context of a conflict like this and sanctions.
Yeah. Although it didn't get a lot of press, we need to be very, very clear that the United Nations was deeply involved in worry about this since the late fall. And that's because Ukraine and other nations brought this attention to the Security Council. It was a concern of many. The Security Council had a knockdown, drag-out fight 3 different times, both the night of the invasion, 2 days after the invasion and the imposition of all the sanctions, and yet again last week, with 14 members voting to condemn the action of Russia and demand a following set of criteria, and even to demand international sanctions that would complement the existing Western sanctions. One of the more famous books about the UN Security Council is called 5 That Rule Them All. They mean the permanent 5 at the UN, which includes the Russians. No resolution can pass the UN Security Council without agreement of the 5. Russia voted down the resolutions. But then there is, of course, another dimension of the UN Security Council, which is when we can't act, we may pass a resolution that doesn't demand the agreement of the P5 to ask the General Assembly, the world convocation of all states, every state, one vote, to issue a condemnation and a set of demands, etc. And that was a huge vote in favor of condemning Russia. A number of states voted neutrally. They abstained. Some states voted in favor of the Russians. But for 194 voting groups, there was something like 150 in favor of condemnation. And so the United Nations has been a real presence. It's in particular been powerful to hear member states that are part of the 10 at the Security Council, the rotating 2-year terms, where the ambassador from Kenya gave a hugely powerful speech about, this is about truth in politics. I'm from a country, he said, where the lies took over and it led to this and this and this and all these terrible things. We cannot have one of the P5 be a country that bastes and lies to us about they're not really at war, they're not committing any atrocities, and on and on and on. And those kinds of things, I think, have been a very powerful statement by the Council, even with its inability to hold Russia in check.
So shifting gears a little bit to a topic that I've heard you talk about in the past, which is peace building, right? Hopefully in the not too distant future, but whenever, at some point this war will end, right? What do you envision, given the work you've done in peace building, is going to be necessary to happen at the conclusion of this war?
Well, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a country that's devastated in every physical and cultural way. You know, we have, it says, a quarter of the Ukrainian population now living outside the boundaries of Ukraine. Right. So that's a devastated society from war, and we're going to have a devastated society economically. two hugely different peace-building challenges. Certainly, there's a way in which Ukraine could recover with massive economic investment and aid and a lot of its people coming back. But that's a logistical challenge that reminds one of Germany in 1945. Right. And what do you do with 4 cities in Ukraine that look a lot like Berlin of April 1945? And we've not done this in the 21st century, and how do you want to do it? And one of the keys to peace building is don't overwhelm the country with your choices as the humanitarian savior, but listen to the people whose culture and ground has been destroyed for how and where and why they want to rebuild it. And so there's got to be a collective set of will, there's got to be planning, there's got to be ways to do this. It's at least, even if the war stopped tomorrow, 2 decades worth of what's going to happen. What happens in Russia? Well, let's say option A is a military stalemate or defeat that Putin, still in charge, decides to make up a reason and declare victory and bring people home, and then demands that sanctions be taken off because the war is over. That's one kind of peace building. What happens there? The other kind of peace building is Mr. Putin goes on vacation somewhere by whatever means and is not in charge. Then who is in charge and what are their credentials? And then option 3 is, over the space of a year with Putin not in charge, there are 5 or 6 competing factions and more people yet in the jails. So there's a lot of bad scenarios ahead, and I think that we are kidding ourselves if we don't recognize those and be really prepared for the Western alliance that's been so well coordinated to do this part, to hang together, to find a way to be sensitive to the different challenges of rebuilding. And I say that with deep concern about the Syrias, the Yemens, the East African nations that used to top the humanitarian disaster list in 2021. They haven't gone away. And so one of the questions for peace builders right now is, what's the humanitarian disaster carrying capacity of the rich and the famous states? How much will we do? How much will we see it as a global challenge of building a new generation that can go forward without war, without economic devastation? Or will there be a point at which we say, hey, some of these folks made their bed? So I think it's a real challenge of everything from individual conscience to collective policy.
So do you think, you mentioned the context in peace building of listening to the people of the country that's being rebuilt and not being kind of the savior that descends. Do you think there is kind of an enlightenment in that direction amongst those people that may lead or fund or play a hand in the process, or are there still many that just feel like they know best for whatever country is being rebuilt?
No, I think the ability to state this way is because there are some hard-earned and hard-won lessons. Okay. I also think that the difference between this peace-building enterprise in a place like Ukraine and Yemen and sections of Syria is this was as we know, major agricultural producer, a set of cities deeply functioning, entrepreneurial, interconnected with Western Europe. And so this is a peace-building enterprise that has both an opportunity and I want to say an obligation of the private sector. One of the great ventures of cooperation between Mendoza and Keogh Kroc over the years has been the course Peace-Building Business on the Front Lines. And business on the front lines was to bring together students of peace and international affairs with international aspiring entrepreneurs from the business school to go out and, under Viva Barkas, and go to Lebanon and see what happened, to go to Bosnia and see what happened, to go to Colombia and see what happened. How do we change, let's say, the Western business calculus that says, whew, very dangerous environment, not a lot of built buildings, I don't think we invest here, versus having a different kind of mindset, a longer view, and be met by the peace builders who say, these folks used to live here, they have some ideas, here's what they used to do. So I think we've got some way to think this through in a way in which, again, 20 years from now, people will wonder, wow, that devastation must have looked terrible. I think I've seen the pictures, but they don't still see it.
So shifting gears one more time before we open it up to the audience for questions. You say failed at retirement, but actually I would, having had the pleasure of knowing you for 6 years, I think you've actually been hugely successful at kind of finding points and times of re-engagement when it's been relevant. But talk a little bit about what's kind of driven that for you, and is there kind of a common theme to what causes you to say, you know what, I'm going to re-engage and leverage the expertise and the knowledge that I have and step away from however the other path was defined?
I think it was a recognition that various aspects, excuse me, of the other path of full-time teaching, full-time research, to full-time consulting, doing this and this, being in and out of the academy, to have the privilege that Notre Dame granted me to go to the policy world here and there, that pace, that structure, it had run its course partly, and you could be more selective about what you wanted to do and do some older things in a new way, but also then embrace some new things that were much more in tune where our sophomores are and other people are, that I just, to put it in the words of one of my adult children, you have no clue how the local culture operates these days, Dad. Okay? And by local culture, he means all the things that we're not in touch with and what actually makes the world go round. I'm part of the old school of the old world of how it goes around, and learning some new things and growing with it. It's also the case that my view of the professoriate, what it means, began to expand. The COVID world, what it meant to teach online and various things, and what it meant to engage online. All of those things, that kind of set of circumstances, met me being willing to have a bit of a transition. And I was very fortunate to be able to play with those dynamics while still embracing the new role of being a grandpa. So there we go.
Which is a critically important role.
Indeed.
So any other questions I should have asked before we open it up to the audience?
I think one of the things might be, especially for our larger audience, what could Notre Dame do in this perilous moment and world? And that's why at least not sure I have an answer to that, but I know we are one of the few universities that can put on the front page of its website, as you pull it up, Ukraine's relationship with Notre Dame and Notre Dame's relationship with Ukraine. And to see not only the extensive contacts that we have, but I'll say with pride from Keogh, Kroc, and others, the flash panels that were immediately created on campus to talk about this situation, the way students came out in little auditoriums like this to talk and ask questions and see, and deep discussions dead of night in the dorms, and on and on and on. And that, I think, is significant. We in Kroc are in a lot of private communication with more than a dozen former Russian students that have Kroc degrees, and about 20 Ukrainian and Poles who have similar degrees, all of whom are working in their own way to try to A, not get killed, B, not get arrested, but still try to make a contribution to what's going on. I think I can share one of the most tender moments of that the other day is in communication with one of our all-star students who was running her own NGO in Ukraine, who said, I never thought, now 20 years past Kroc, I would stay awake at night wondering, maybe you're not a pacifist anymore. And war does that. But at the same time, Notre Dame trained somebody to be bothered by that question. And I think, where does Notre Dame go in this? Business on the front lines, the kinds of connections we have, the professional programs we have across a whole series of things. We're going to need some of our psychology folks who've worked with trauma healing in various American communities to come over to Europe and spend some time, because there's going to be a lot of trauma healing that's needed there. And that's a significant part of peace building and the recovering of community. So that's where the question I would ask, okay, Irish, get together, let's go.
Wonderful. We'll move now to Q&A. I just asked the live audience to wait for the microphone to get to you, so those people that are on virtually, and then Emily will bring questions that have been assembled from the virtual audience. So we'll open it up for questions.
Professor, great to have you here. Quick question. In your analysis of sanctions, I assume you always assume that there are state actors like China and India who aren't going to get involved, so you're not going to have unanimity. Is that part of, when you, as an expert in sanctions, is that always part of your analysis that you won't have unanimity? And the second part of the question is, I think most Americans, at least from what I've read, are not surprised by China's decision, but more concerned about India's decision, although we understand why with 50% of their military being purchased from Russia. But I mean, do you see opportunities for India to get on board to make those sanctions stronger?
You know, this is a great question for both the immediate sanctions. Why haven't they been more supportive, and what do we do? But it's especially, I'm going to say, it's especially going forward so important. Because, yes, you always calculate, is there a key trading partner? Is there a key identity connection that's going to prevent a group, make it unlikely that that leadership will support the sanctions at the same level? China, a bigger concern because direct requests have been made to them by Putin for military hardware. We haven't seen a large response, okay? The response on the Chinese side has been mostly, we are not going to politically condemn this. We're open to exchanges. We want to be in the leadership of diplomacy. Well, they certainly haven't shown being in the leadership of diplomacy. So take that for what it's worth. India, for exactly the reasons you said, that they can't feel at this stage they can incur the costs. Now, what leakage are they providing in a way that would disturb the other sanctions? I think it's minimal. It would be significant if they came around and were willing to accept some costs. To stop there in the analysis, though, while it looks like we're going to have two outliers, there is continued dialogue between Washington and some of the European governments and India and China. And if there comes a point to which it looks like, particularly the relationships between those two countries, respectively, and Putin, is sort of preventing some things from happening, that the rest of the sanctions might happen, then I think secondary sanctions may be on the table. We've certainly sanctioned India under other conditions about their own nuclear proliferation at a different era, and that may be possible. Biden may say to China, I'm not going to sanction you, but I can lift a number of the trade barriers that the prior administration put in. I'd like to incentivize you to more cooperation. And then the last part, in terms of my answer, is yes, we know the moment we're in. We know the moment of the last 10 weeks of sanctions or however long it's been. But there's 3, 4, 5 months going forward. Is there a point at which Putin behavior and what Russia's doing becomes appalling even to their friends? And that China puts the finger in the wind and says, we get no benefits from support. This guy's done. Why would we continue to support? We'll see. I don't think any of us have an answer to that, but it's possible. And I think you have to take the long view when you're dealing with a China and an India.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to ask you, assuming that this conflict plays out without the involvement of NATO countries, do you see any effect on globalization going forward?
You know, I think for the reasons I mentioned before about what the character of rebuilding and peacebuilding might be, those who pronounce globalization dead, I think are premature in their assessment. I think you might see a particular burst of globalization like you've not seen before. I worry that the globalization of the military alliance on the Western side quite frankly, might deepen in ways that overreact. I know it may sound strange to use the term overreact to what Putin has done, but if one of the concerns of a future Russian leadership that links to Putin and links to his predecessors is we're encircled, I don't want the globalization of a Sweden and a Finland coming into the NATO alliance. We're not going to need that in the future to hold the future of Russia militarily in check. So I think it depends on how you define globalization. We had thought all predictions of every international relations theorist, whether you're a sort of a conservative rightist, might is right thinker, or a peace side of this, said the more interdependent economies don't go to war. Putin somehow decided he could hold the interdependence at bay and resummon it at will, and boom, run a war anyway. Doesn't work that way. Interdependence and globalization is with us, but be ready to be creative and have it take a new form.
So this question may sound tongue-in-cheek, but it comes from one of our visitors. It's a simple question. Why doesn't the world just take Putin out? The Western world.
That's a good question. Because you don't have a replacement. You don't have a clue as to what that unleashes. And more importantly, having, I would say, rightly imposed a self-discipline that's still consistent with international law of force, why would you go across the line and then therefore say, because the other guy was so bad, that now gives me license to go so bad? It's the same reason I and others said you don't impose any of these sanctions before the invasion, because that sanction, unprovoked, would be its own act of economic war and give them full license to do whatever they want. Okay? And don't assume you can take Putin out. Don't assume a massive bombing of the Kremlin takes Putin out. And so either you're going to go all in and decide, I wish I talked to my aunt one more time in New York before they nuked it, or not. And it's very clear that we have a responsibility that some will characterize as, oh, our hands are tied behind our back and the bad guys always win. No, you have a responsibility to the now that you can in some ways control, but others can't. And you have a responsibility to what happens the day after.
Go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Thanks a lot. Sanctions can be used to put pressure on offending parties, to persuade offending parties. Perhaps they could be used strategically, offensively. And some people have even suggested that sanctions could be used to start building up a kitty or a reserve to help support Ukraine once the war is finally over. Are there things that sanctions either can't do or shouldn't do, and how do you sort of balance the different views that different parties have in terms of what they want to accomplish with sanctions, in terms of deciding what the sanctions are going to be and how to structure packages?
In the late 90s, there was a significant move of the global system financially and experts on sanctions and government officials to decide that the general big trade sanctions that could do seemingly a lot of what you mentioned, but also then had devastating effects on innocent people, they should be broken up into smaller packages called targeters or smart sanctions. Bank asset freezes, travel sanctions, sanctions on banks, sanctions on sovereign wealth funds, sanctions on goods of a particular type and commodity, and on and on and on. And the theory was we could choose among the good lists that you mentioned which sanction matched which goal, and be able to both control the effect of the sanctions and also maybe limit the unintended consequences. This situation, as Tom and I talked about earlier, and you all heard, this is a collection of all of those at once. Boom. So what can we expect of those? What can we think that they can achieve? They can partly achieve, you hope always, an opening by which the other side is going to try to strike a bargain because the economic pain has become too severe. You mentioned as one of the categories, can you sanction in a way in which you've got funds to help rebuild? Yes, you can, and there's already some discussion of that. Not so little discussion in international financial law about that. When the Security Council imposed sanctions on Libya in February of 2011, they grabbed tons of sovereign debt resources held by the Gaddafi family and by the country in unison in European banks. Maybe as many as $30 billion worth. Some say maybe as much as $60 billion. Because it was a Security Council resolution that sparked those being seized by those countries. The resolution says they will be released to a competent and popular supported Libyan government for the reconstruction of Libya. That hasn't happened yet, but they're there in reserve. When we froze, we meaning the Western group, froze Russian assets, we put no such stricture on those. We simply said they're frozen. Some are saying, well, when this is all over, the dust clears and Putin isn't there and whatever, we should sell those yachts of the oligarchs. We should take that $130 billion that Putin thought he could bring back and couldn't, and there's the beginning of the reconstruction of Ukraine. Maybe, but there's some legal arguments that say, no, you shouldn't do it that way. And it may be that's the basis of rebuilding the Russian economy because it was their assets to start with. We punish them through denial, but we don't have to punish them through permanent seizure, would say a very strict international law financial interpretation.
I think we have time for a couple more questions here, and then I'll do one more from the audience, Patrick, and then Eric.
Professor, I'd really be interested in a historical question, a perspective. Two great coalitions that we have lived through. This one today, led by the United States, and the early 1990s in Kuwait and the Middle East, which was arguably contextually a more difficult coalition, also led by the United States. So first, the importance of the United States in these coalitions, and then secondly, maybe a little comparison to, we know how the 1991-92 ended, maybe how we hold it together, and will we be as successful as we were then?
Yeah, I mean, there's a military dimension to that with cases that are dramatically different. This was an international force led by the United States, but still an international force and supported by the unanimity of the Security Council to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. And it was very clear that that was the goal. President Bush at the time honored that goal. And when all those troops were gone, he didn't pursue deeper into Iraq. Could have. It's one of the great questions of history. Could you have taken out Saddam then and be done with it? But then what? Militarily, it's a very different situation here. There is no Security Council unanimity because one of them is the protagonist. And it's not a multilateral force in any way. It's Ukrainians defending their homeland against Russian troops. So that part is different. The part that I would see as comparable a bit are the sanctions. We use sanctions in the hope. Sanctions were imposed in August of 1990, giving Saddam a deadline by which troops needed to be removed and assets seized of the Kuwaitis to be returned to them. When that deadline was violated, the sanctions were imposed. Those sanctions, though, were the only sanctions we knew we could do well at the time. Those were comprehensive trade sanctions. An economy that's dependent on one primary product export of high revenue, perfect economy to impose trade sanctions on, because you immediately zapped his ability to earn any foreign currency. And those took their toll. What is intriguing here, though, and is quite possible, is the kind of sword of Damocles holding over the head of the international community for the decade after the war was over in Iraq was the continual use of sanctions and the moving of the goalposts by which they would be removed. And do you, in a post-Russian-Ukrainian war, continue the sanctions on Russia and continue to move the goalposts, or is there an international agreement about you've got to move from sanctions to incentives to rebuilding and worry about some of the niceties later, just simply because we know what it led to in Iraq to continue the sanctions. It led to us going to war in Iraq 12 years after the sanctions and the military campaign supposedly achieved our objectives.
So before we go to Eric, let me just do one more question from virtual. It's from Mary from California. She says, thank you for your contributions. Given the atrocities that have occurred and most likely will continue to occur, how long can you wait for sanctions to work to make for peace?
Yeah, no, good question. And I think you don't have to wait a day longer for sanctions to do something about the mass atrocities. There are two very, very different parallels. As I mentioned earlier, these sanctions didn't have an illusion that they were going to prevent daily actions of a military sort, except in ways in which you might be able to deny ammunition, you might be able to deny spare parts, you might be able to capture mercenaries at a border before they snuck across a border to come help. They weren't going to have a military impact. But as I think we're seeing and should see and we'll see more of, there's an international community of human rights, lawyers, and other concerned parties, and the incredible people on the ground that are documenting the atrocities, the way the international press is helping to document, satellite photography. We have all the assets to bring to the fore dozens and dozens of war crimes. And that can continue whether or not the sanctions are in effect, whether or not they're effective, and we're dealing with troops on the ground who are operative with total misinformation as to why they're there and what's going on. The stuff is just going to continue. But there's nothing even if you're an analyst who thinks the sanctions have stalled, that ought to stop us in going ahead and saying, we will get our day in court, however court is defined, to make amends for these war crimes.
Professor, thank you for being here. In your role, especially as being an emeritus professor, all your years of scholarship and study, when and how and what will the process be to really study these sanctions and the impact?
I think that the study groups, in a sense, are already forming. It's a coalition of transnational scholars, former people in government who worked in sanctions, think tanks in various stripes, and they're looking at some of the questions we addressed. You know, what sector of the Russian economy is damaged? Which way? What would a remedy be? What's going to be the, even let's say, redress rights of an American firm that lost all its assets? The Russian government took it over, but Putin's no longer in charge. How do you get those assets back? Do you, is this a bargained arrangement, or is this illegal? All of that stuff is in the works, and it's going to continue for generations, I'm afraid. The group I'm most associated with is the Old Guys Sanctions Network, Emeritus people, who were present at the table, as we were fortunate to be in the 90s, when the international system decided to move from the comprehensive sanctions to targeted sanctions. So some of us are really interested in seeing what banking sanctions did and didn't do. Some are looking at the relationship between the immediate decline of the ruble took because of the holding of assets and the inflation cycle and what that did. Did that drive these people in the upper middle class, hey, we're out of here, take all the dollars and pounds you have and let's get out of here. And these kinds of things. The other is very, very important. What's the humanitarian impact of sanctions? And the people who were hardest hit are the people in the streets, some of whom were protesting the war in the streets. What amends is made to them? Do they get those frozen assets from overseas as a way to rebuild the civil society, and under what conditions? What do the Russians get versus what the Ukrainians get as the spoils of sanctions, etc.? Who rebuilds the Russian economy? The Russians or the West? Is this Europe in 1945 all over again?
Well, George, I hate to bring this to an end because I think we could have gone on for quite a bit longer, but I want to thank you not only for joining us, but very importantly for the great work you're doing. I think you truly do represent what this institution hopes to stand for, and that it's a force for good in bringing the powers of academia together with kind of your real and practical impact on the world. So thank you for all of that. And for those of you online, I just want to thank you very much for joining us. You can find earlier conversations that we've had with Father Richard Rohr and Jerome Bettis. And we have an upcoming conversation with Carrie Hannon by going to think.nd.edu or else to our website, ili.nd.edu. So we hope to see you at a future installment. And George, thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you.